afternoon. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm glad that I can talk about my recent research. I first would like to thank the authorities of this university. I would like to thank the Dean of the faculty. I would like to thank my translator and friend, Yevgeny, who translated my book, Discours et Lust. I'm glad to be here for the first time in my life in Belgorod. And I hope to have a discussion about my work on discourse and knowledge. For those of you who don't understand English very well, I will try to speak slowly. Afterwards we have time to do some questions. What I would like to do is to present the work of my research of the last 5-6 years. I mean, to give you an idea of where I have come from. You can always find it in my website, which is easy. It is discourses, plural, discourses with an s.org. Also, my email is there. If you ever have questions about the research I'm doing, you can always send me a message, and I always reply to all messages of any student in the world. So write me if you have questions, okay? So discourses.org, where you can find also many papers and books for free on my website. And also the history of the work I've been doing you can find on my website. So I won't go into this now in detail, but I started in modern literature, in French poetry, French surrealist poetry. And my interest in discourse and text comes from reading poetry, you know, and doing close reading of discourse is very important when you do poetry. So I went from poetry to the linguistic structure of poetry, and to do the linguistic structure of poetry you need a linguistic of texts and not of sentences, as we knew from Chomsky for you, and many other linguists. So I was interested more and more in the 60s, and my dissertation now 40 years ago was on text grammars. And then I was more and more interested also in the psychology of discourse, namely what are the mental processes involved in the production and comprehension of discourse. So what I'm going to talk to today about is still very much influenced by this work on the cognitive aspects of discourse. And I worked in the 1970s with a colleague of mine from the United States called Walter Kinch. And in 1983, now 30 years ago, we published a book called Strategies of Discourse Comprehension, and it gives the basic theory of the things I'm going to tell today, but it's much more developed, of course, after 30 years. And in the 1980s, I not only limited my work to the structures of discourse and text at all levels of analysis, and not only the structures of mental representations and the mental cognitive processes of producing and understanding discourse, but more and more in the 1980s also introduced a social component, namely to see how discourse has a role in the production and the reproduction of power. And the new book, Discourse and Power, now published here in Russia in Russian, is one of the ways I would like to show how we can do some kind of critical discourse analysis to see how discourse has a role in the reproduction of power, and especially power abuse, domination in society. And the main topic I've been researching within this field of critical discourse analysis is racism. Since the early 1980s, beginning in Amsterdam, Holland, and then also in Spain and Latin America, where I go a lot, I've been studying how people talk about people from other cultures, other countries, ethnic minorities, and so on. I want to know how in dominant discourse, in the media, in politics, and in education, like textbooks, people write about migrants, immigrants, minorities, foreigners, other countries, other cultures. And I want to know how this particular kind of ethnocentrism, xenophobia, racism, Eurocentrism, anti-Semitism, and so on, how it is produced and reproduced through discourse. And within this broad field of critical discourse analysis, I also have been focusing in the 1980s, not only on power, but also on the notion of ideology. And ideology has one thing in common with the topic today, namely that it's also a form of social cognition. So it is cognition, so it has to do with the minds of people, it has to do with memory, it has to do with cognitive processes and representation, but at the same time